what is the background behind Jewish Cemetery of Newport?
Okay. I thought you might be asking that question. So the Longfellows, there was no air conditioning back in the 1850s and the 1860s. And if you're a person of means, you repaired to the seashore or to the mountains, to the Berkshires, or to the Adirondacks. The Longfellows, for many years, had a cottage on Nahant, which is off the coast of Boston. It's actually almost like an island. It's a little slip of land that juts out into north of Boston. But they also went to Newport, Rhode Island, which then, as now, is a kind of a peninsula, right? But a haven for people of means and where they vacationed. And in 1852, the Longfellows went and spent a summer on what was called the Cliff House. That particular house is no longer there. It's now occupied by a college, Salve Regina. And it's a short walk from downtown where the Jewish cemetery is and the Jewish synagogue, the Torah Synagogue, which, by the way, was established. The Torah Synagogue was built in 1763, so it's during colonial times, and it is the oldest standing synagogue in North America. It continues, and the cemetery there is the second oldest Jewish cemetery in North America. There's one older down in the lower tip of Manhattan. So in 1852, Longfellow was vacationing. In 1852, he's now been married for 9 years with Fanny, and they're Julia Ward Howe and her husband, Samuel Gridley Howe, their house guests. But Henry goes off on a walk on his own, as he did. And he's walking downtown. And I don't know if you're familiar with Newport, Rhode Island. I am. It's not far from where I am now, or where I live. I've spent a lot of time there. And he's walking by, and he sees these gravestones behind a closed, locked fence. And it's still not open to it because there are only 39 gravestones in there. He wonders what it is. And he can see some strange inscriptions on the stones, and it's locked. And there's a caretaker who lets him in and shows him around. And what he's looking at are the gravestones of this first Jewish community in Rhode Island, which dates back to 1658. 1658. The colony of Rhode Island is established in 1639, only 20 years after the Roger Williams came from Massachusetts, where he's Catholic, and he's thrown out of Massachusetts, and so he's looking for a place to establish freedom of worship or whatever. And Rhode Island is the place where he goes, and they actually make it known that all faiths are welcome in Rhode Island, and especially in the little seaport town of Newport. And in 1658, a group of Sephardic Jews who had been in Barbados and actually escaped the Inquisition in Spain from the 1500s, they establish a community in Newport. And it's a good-sized community. But by the time Longfellow, this is again 1658, when he comes and walks by the cemetery in 1852, the community is gone. Now, what's happened is the Jewish community were not loyal to the British cause during the American Revolution. They were not Tory supporters. So they left during this about 1760s, leading up to the American Revolution. So while the cemetery was still there and the synagogue was still there, the synagogue was inactive. It's active again now. And so this gentleman tells Longfellow, I presume, about so much of this history. So that's the backstory. And then he writes this poem, The Jewish Cemetery at Newport. And of course, he's very interested in, it'll be a year or two after that, he goes to work on Hiawatha, when he's talking also about what they saw as the vanishing race of Native Americans. He incorrectly assumes, of course, I guess, and there's one of the great stories about the final stanza of that poem is where he is. I'll read it to you because it's only 4 lines. But he writes, "What once has been shall be no more." This is the big mistake he makes. "The groaning earth in travail and in pain brings forth its races, but it does not restore. And the dead nations never rise again." Well, that's a huge mistake, isn't it? It's 100 years there is in Israel, and there is a thriving Israel, and he didn't foresee that. But at the time, this is considered, by the way, one of the very first sympathetic treatments of Jews in America by an American writer. I don't think you can find anyone that writes anything before him. And it's a pretty long poem. I encourage your listeners you can find it online. Just do a Google, the Jewish cemetery at Newport, read it. It's a fascinating poem. There's some fabulous, beautiful lines in there. He goes through the history, how strange it seems, these Hebrews in their graves, close by the street of this fair seaport town, silent beside the never silent waves, at rest in all this moving up and down. So he's walking in this seaport town, and he sees these inscriptions of Portuguese names and Hebrew names, and he wonders, what is this in New England? And of course he finds that history, and he writes knowledgeably about Hebrew history in the poem. And it actually inspired a rejoinder by Emma Lazarus, who wrote the great Colossus. And she was not pleased with Longfellow's take on this for a variety of reasons. She writes another poem some years. Of course, she writes it after Longfellow's death in the 1880s, and 30 or so years after this poem was written. And now there's a new wave of Jewish immigrants coming to the United States and a new population. I think if he'd had that poem to think about 20 or 30 years later, it would have been different. But it's got as we say, backstory, a fabulous backstory to it. And it's absolutely well-meaning and sympathetic. Interpretation-wise, well, maybe it's not a good idea to be a prophet in a poem sometimes.